my first assignment is to live down that introduction. A lot of the stuff that we heard is old stuff, and now I'm doing something quite different from the time that I wrote that very naive account of attempts to model brain function. And what I'm going to talk about now is almost exclusively psychophysics. Although we do have theoretical efforts going in the lab, they don't come anywhere close to the required sophistication. So this picture is the main inspiration for nearly all the work I do now and for my talk. And with any luck, you will see things there that you don't expect to see. And I promise you it's not a movie. Okay, so this is Illusionary Motion. It's a painting in oils by Issa Levion, a French artist, done in 1984, deliberately for the purpose of inducing this illusion. And his friends tell me that it took him 15 years of one trial after another before he got this one, which works quite well. We have put it in our computer and fiddled all the imaginable parameters, the number of spokes, the thickness of them, and so on, and we could not do better than this painter did in oils by trial and error. And so the question now is, how do we understand this? And the working hypothesis is going to be that this is a reflection of cortical noise, a certain kind of instability in the cortex, and that that noise can produce this kind of an illusion by virtue of a mechanism called synaptic resonance. Stochastic resonance, which I think is a misnomer, as I will explain. Anyhow, you all see this. What's interesting and what really got me hooked on this particular painting was that I made some copies and showed it to some friends who were having dinner at our house, and everybody saw it, and that's lovely and how exciting and so on. And then after dinner, one of the guests wandered over and looked at it again. He said, "I can't see it anymore." Now, luckily, this guy was a physician who was one of the experts on alcoholism. And so he said, "You know, I've had 3 glasses of red wine." And so we decided that maybe we could learn something from studying the statistic of this. And about a year later, I was discussing with my students, how could we legally do an experiment where we get students drunk? And the answer is that I would get fired if I tried to do that on the campus. So one of them volunteered to give a party in his own apartment for 15 physics graduate students. And I said, "Okay, I don't know anything about it, but I'll pay for the wine." And the answer was not surprising, but it was surprising. Out of the 15 students, 13 of them saw a weakening, just as my friend, the physician, had seen. But for 2 of them, it got better. And so this leads me to the punchline at the end, which is my present superstition, that the brain maintains a certain level of noise. And I will give arguments and show you examples why that's useful. It's a mechanism which engineers and mathematicians call stochastic resonance. And so maintaining that level of noise optimizes visual acuity and other brain performances. And if you have too much red wine, you reduce the noise, and therefore you begin to get not so good at various things. But there's occasionally a person who I call hyper. And this guy has too much noise in his brain, and therefore a little bit of red wine improves his performance. So that's absolutely a guess. But the fact is that there were 2 out of 15 whose performance improved, and all the rest degraded. So in order to examine this, I built this thing which I call a racetrack. I didn't build it. My students wrote the program which shows you this. And they made 3,000 of these, and each one is absolutely random and independent of all the others. And so we stacked up the 3,000 random displays like this, and we showed the stack as a movie, which I am now going to show you. And it's guaranteed to be random. Now, some people have the illusion that this is rotating. How many of you see a rotation? Okay. Right hand means you see clockwise at this moment. Clockwise. How many see left hand? Left hand is counterclockwise. So it's about 50-50. You're all seeing the same demonstration. And if you watch it for a while, you'll see it reversing. And now it's interesting. When you see a particular direction, say to yourself, I want it to reverse. Some people see two. But most people see one direction. They can want it to reverse, and it does. And if you want to make friends to the person sitting next to you, tap him or her on the shoulder unexpectedly and see whether it reverses. So bottom line, it does. And we've examined, you bite your tongue, you press your toe down. I blew in my wife's ear with a little rubber syringe. All of that works. And so the conclusion is that anything you do which disturbs your tranquility, or in another more modest way, grabs your attention, causes it to reverse. And the reason for that is there's a thing called synaptic depression, which means that there are certain sensors that are acting when you see the thing going counterclockwise, for example, and they get tired. It's a mechanism called synaptic depression, because the synapse depends on synthesizing protein to make neurotransmitter substance, which then jumps across the synapse from one neuron to the other, and pretty soon it uses up the supply of neurotransmitter until the protein synthesis can repair it. And that's why you see a reversal occasionally here. Okay. Now we're going to go to another one. Can you also will this one to reverse?
Yeah. You're working really fast. It's much faster.
It's a little faster, but most of you can see it reverse. Okay. Can you reverse this one?
This is counter curve.
Okay. So there are a lot of yeses and some maybes and some nos. Okay, next one. Can you reverse that?
No.
A lot of no's. Okay. Incidentally, this is really a test of your willpower. This one is difficult for most people. Okay, so this one, hardly anybody can reverse it. What I've been doing is gradually reducing the randomness, which you cannot tell by looking at the texture. What I've been doing is sneaking in a little bit of correlation, so that, in this case, 50% of the dots that you see at one moment have a partner in the next frame, which is right next to it. So you get an A-B situation. And that is the basis for all of our movies, television, everything that we observe for perceiving motion. And so it's a very strong, reliable mechanism. And that's what I used to make this thing harder and harder to reverse, so that you were committed to the embedded direction. I think maybe the next one. Let me try something else. Oops. So most of you probably will see a dot jumping back and forth. And that is the primitive motion cue that I was using to bias the racetrack so you preferred a particular direction. But now, hold up your hand and cover this one. It's not going anywhere. So it's not moving, but when you see that sequence, you get the illusion of motion, which, as I say, is the basis of movies and television and so on. But also, you probably also know that our eyes are dancing around 3 or 4 times per second. And how we put all that together must depend on mechanisms of this kind. But it's not really understood. Okay, now, what's an interesting thing. If you sit there, or if you're a naive observer in the sense of psychologists, namely you haven't seen the test before, and you come into our lab and you look at this racetrack, the one that doesn't have any bias in it, it seems to reverse rotation every couple seconds on the average. And this is the distribution of the probability of reversal, and this peak is at around 2 seconds or so, plus or minus 1. So the unmotivated brain, the passive observer, sees that reversal every 2 seconds or so. And so now the question is, what's going on? Why should that happen? And so we will discuss that a little bit. If you put an electrode into the visual cortex of a rat, you get a burst of activity every 2 seconds. This is work by Mark Rachel. I'm not allowed to put an electrode in human brains, but I'm trying to convince friends who use MEG setups to see whether they can detect a pulse at 2-second intervals. If so, it's a real problem for the anatomists and the physiologists. That is, what could be happening in the brain that generates a sort of burst of activity every 2 seconds? We know that there's something going on in the heart, so we can get a heartbeat every second, roughly. So this is something else. We joke, we call it the brain beat. But it's a real thing, and to try to find out what causes it is one of the things that we're working on. So this is a movie, and I would ask you to watch it for maybe another 10 seconds or so. And then I'm going to stop it, and I want you to keep watching it. So this thing is called the motion after effect. It was first observed by a physicist named Aristotle. And he was sitting next to, on the bank of a river, watching junk float by on the river. And he noticed when he looked to the side at the banks, the junk seemed to go the other way. And the mechanism is thought to be very simple. Namely, it's this case of fatigue. There are certain motion sensors that are sensitive to motion this way, and other sensors in the visual system sensitive to that. And if you constantly work one set, they become fatigued, which means really they run out of neurotransmitter in the vesicles. And then the other one dominates because of the ambient noise in the environment. Those cells are more energetic. So this is evidence for this mechanism called synaptic depression that's been known for a very long time. Now here's another common illusion invented by a Swiss psychologist named Necker. I'm sure you've all seen this. And the game here is to look at this cube and see if you can force it to turn inside out. So first this side here seems to be in front, and then you can force it to make this one be in front. And this is like your ability to reverse the racetrack whenever you wanted to. But there's a big difference. Namely, it takes a few seconds, and it's very iffy to be able to reverse this. But the racetrack reversed right now, within tens or maybe 50s of milliseconds. But this is a three-dimensional concept, and so it requires higher centers in the brain to compute and change a percept. While the racetrack has the charm as a tool of psychophysics of being very front end, doesn't involve three-dimensional, doesn't involve shape perception and analysis, and that's why it's so fast, and that's why we find it a useful tool. And I'm told by a friend who's written a review article on all of these bistable. You've all seen the face and vase one. You put two vases together, and the space in between looks like a face. No, the other way around. Two faces, and you get a vase. But that also takes time, because again, it requires shape analysis. Now, what's remarkable, we have a correlation with Georgopoulos and David Crow in Minnesota, because they preside over this very elaborate magnetoencephalography thing. And I haven't gone to visit them yet, but they told me that they can see and measure a magnetic change at the scalp of the brain when a person reports they see a reversal in the direction of rotation. Now, it's not published yet, and there are going to be a lot of critical controls to be done, but they say it's a very strong effect. So that's remarkable, and in some sense, you can tell, to overstate it, what a person is thinking, or at least what they're perceiving, by matching their report with the objective measurement of magnetic fields. So then we started fooling around. And I got to tell you, I wouldn't dare bring marijuana into my lab, but luckily I have a colleague at UCSF, which is the medical school of the University of California in San Francisco, who actually had a government grant, it does have, for, they couldn't bring themselves to say that he was supposed to study the effect of marijuana in controlling pain. But that's really what he wanted to do. This guy's an oncologist. So instead, the grant read that you're supposed to study whether marijuana interferes with the action of known painkillers. That's what the grant says. But of course, the guys in the NIH knew what they were doing, and so he's studying. And so he lets us piggyback. And we don't see the patients. We don't know anything about them. So we hand over our laptop to his nurse, and then she gets these curves. And bottom line, what we do is we make a racetrack in which we deliberately switch the direction. And if you're not stoned, you can do quite well as we increase the amount of correlation. So this is what I guess you call it a sober person. And this 0.5 here means that half the dots are being correlated. And that was the one that you couldn't reverse. So that's very strong. But when they're stoned in varying degrees, they're not as able to detect a switch. And my friend's main goal was to see whether it's better to smoke a joint or to use vapor. So they have a vaporizer like you use when you have a head cold. And so this is a certain dose, smoking it, and certain... Anyway, bottom line, he could write a wonderful paper in the medical journals that is just as good for using marijuana to use a vaporizer, and you don't risk lung cancer. And so for scientific studies, that's what they're going to do. So I thought, because I had this idea that static in the brain, by static I mean sort of random firings of neurons. Each firing of a neuron is a 70 millivolt pulse about 1 millisecond wide, and they're all about the same size. And so one thought that, and in fact, if you put an electrode in your hand and measure or somewhere and measure the pressure of a finger, the harder you press, the more spikes you get per second. So in the most simple interpretation, the spike rate tells you the intensity of whatever it is that's being perceived. That's not true for certain insects like blowflies, in which the interspike interval is like a Morse code. which contains information about the nature of the stimulus. And there are big debates about it, but I think the consensus is that in mammals, it's only the spike rate that counts. And, but it's not settled. It's still somewhat controversial. So I then assumed that what we were seeing was that marijuana and ethanol were reducing the spike rate. But luckily, I have a computer which knows how to find Google, and I looked it up. And what do you know? Ethanol and marijuana do not reduce the spike rate significantly. What they do is interfere with synchrony. And so then the question is, why is synchrony important? And say, well, the different parts of the brain have to work together and so on. I think it's much simpler. I think that if you have synchrony, then not only one spike indicates an event, but 100 firing together are required to give a strong enough signal to be believed by the customer in the brain. And so I think that synchrony is very important as a way of reducing noise, because if you had single spikes, then the fluctuations in the signal would be enormous. But if 100 spikes are required all at once, then it doesn't matter if they're 99 or 101. It's a very statistically reliable signal. And so synchrony is important for that reason, and therefore the effect of marijuana and of ethanol, again, there's big literature on that, which I found through Google, does seem to be effective. So here's an important mechanism called stochastic. Well, the literature calls it stochastic resonance, but there's nothing resonant about it. I think it's a misnomer. I'm calling it stochastic sampling. So suppose you have a signal, which I don't mean it to be periodic, but which varies. And I'll suppose for concreteness that we think of a very dim incandescent light bulb. But it's so dim that it's below the threshold. And so it's going up and down, but you can't tell that. Now suppose you add noise to it, as indicated by the high-frequency spikes here. Every now and then, when the imperceptible signal is at a maximum, then that plus noise can exceed the threshold and be perceived. So that's an example of noise being useful in improving sensitivity to weak signals. And here's a curve that you can deduce from changing this thing and running a simulation. The mutual information, which is a quantitative measure of the correlation between these signals and the perception, goes up as you add noise. But then when you have too much noise, the thing is a total mess, and you don't see it. So it's a very important principle, which I think is probably instrumented in the brain to generate just the right noise level so that you're not half asleep and you're not hyper, but you're at the point here where your sensitivity is maximum, which is obviously what you'd want to do. And here's a three-dimensional, well, it's two-dimensional image of the same thing. So here is Big Ben in London, but so sparse that you really can't see it. Then imagine you sprinkle little black dots at random on it. Occasionally, one of those little black dots will find itself next to one of the original dots, which you couldn't see, but you can see a double dot or something like that, maybe triple. And so this becomes then visible. And then if you do too much, it gets to be noisy, and pretty soon you obscure it altogether. So that's a two-dimensional example of stochastic resonance. Now here's a cute one. Some people develop insensitivity in the soles of their feet, particularly if they've had diabetes for a long time. And then they fall down a lot. And so, because your balance, of course, depends on your semicircular canals in your ears, but it also depends on the pressure on your feet. And if the feet become insensitive, then you can try to use stochastic resonance by putting a little bit of noise into the insole of your shoe. And it turns out you can put in such a small amount of noise that the person can't tell whether its noise is turned on or not, because it is, as I showed in the diagram, sub-threshold. But it's sufficient to increase the total signal. And I don't know if you can buy these things, but these are insoles with little motors in them that generate noise at a very low level that you can't feel. And people who wear these things don't fall down as much, not nearly. And just yesterday I found a new thing on Google. Here's a lady wearing these soles, and a mirror was attached to the back of her blouse so that you could follow her motion of her body. And when the noise was on, she wavered around like this, and when the noise was up, like this. And I think this was a normal person, not a diabetic, without any particular insensitivity. So the bottom line that I draw from all of this is that the brain has to regulate the pulse rate, the body temperature, the body pressure, all kinds of things. Well, one more thing the brain has to regulate is its own noise content, because there's an optimal value of it, and I can't imagine that it's not under some kind of control, since it seems to be so effective. I don't know if that's a commonly held view, but that's sort of my provisional notion. And here are the people in my lab who have all contributed in one way or another, mostly by writing all the software for these demonstrations and for putting up with large numbers of undergraduates who are guinea pigs for collecting the data. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Glaser. Floor is open for questions. Please introduce yourself for your question.
James Bacigalupi, and I'm just wondering, does the noise create a problem for digital models, or can it just be added in?
I haven't tried. I haven't made any digital models. But I suspect that it will play a role, depending an awful lot on the details.
Stand there and just follow up with the question. We found when using very simple visual models of modeling the brain behavior of vision of vertical, horizontal, and blob detection, that noise actually doesn't seem to disturb it like it would with conventional AI visual systems. It seems to ignore anomalies in the computations. If there's a flash or a disturbance or a reflection, that doesn't seem to perturb the motion of the robot in a visual field of motion. I'm not sure why that phenomenon there. It seems to smooth it out.
There's a pretty sizable literature on the theory of stochastic resonance, as it's called. By the way, as far as I can tell, the reason it's called stochastic resonance is that you get a big effect from a tiny amount of noise. But there's no frequency involved, so it isn't really resonance as we know it. Would you repeat your question?
Just say again the question. Message repeat again.
It wasn't really a question. I was just stating that in preliminary visual models, we found that the randomness of noise, a flash, a light, or some other disturbance in the visual field in cognitive models of vision systems embedded in robotic real systems, that it doesn't seem to disturb like it does if you have AI-based systems or things that are using rule-based to react to vision cues, like video tracking cards.
Thank you. Now I recall now.
Good. Yeah, if you actually do the mathematics, what you find is that this stochastic resonance, or sampling as I call it, requires several things. The system has to be nonlinear, and it has to have a threshold. And so for those cases, the things I've showed you may be quite general.
Hi, Steve Beck, visiting fellow. Your research is fascinating with visual phenomenon. I wonder if you know of or have done anything with auditory sounds that's comparable to this visual research.
Yeah, we're starting to play with that. We just got some fairly fancy earphones, and we're trying to see whether various levels of noise. What we discovered so far is that a click will cause you to switch from one mode to another, but a gentle sound won't. So we're fooling around with all kinds of bells and whistles and stuff. But I don't have anything very organized except to know that I expect these phenomena will play a role in audition.
So I have a question for you. We had a project, we were working with a series of experts that are actually listening to the acoustic wave. And this was for recognition of the faulty systems or actually correct systems. And usually expect that expert through the time, his expertise increases. But we find that for this type of the acoustic the diagnosis, is actually they have a lifetime of the 2 year. So they actually increase, and after through the time, they start increasing.
Say again, what is it that has a lifetime of 2 years?
The lifetime of expertise. So instead of just they increase their areas, yes, to understand the fault or not a fault. In fact, first it increases, and actually through the time, after 2 years, they get to the point that they are not actually valuable into the recognizing these acoustic waves. And I noticed some of this motion that you are looking at the fatigue, that it happens, like for example, you see this motion happening indirectly, and then you stop it, it's going down and up. So is there anything in that's the same question that Steve asked in the audio that it can be correlated to that?
I don't know. I haven't tried it. I expect there would be, except the waterfall effect.
Right.
Or the reverse, the motion after effect. There's a whole book called Motion After Effect, of which that's just one example. It's a really charming book. Depends on there being a two-way thing embedded in noise, so whichever dominating signal is weaker, then the rest of it is dominated by the noise. Now, in audition, I don't know, maybe you could play games with the two ears, so maybe your directional sense could be damaged by hearing too much from one side for a long time. But I don't know. I've never tried it.
Thank you. Please.
I didn't get any effect from the oil painting illusion, the first one. I was wondering what was supposed to happen.
And say again, you didn't what?
I got no effect from the first image that was meant to produce.
That cartwheel thing?
The cartwheel thing.
Yeah.
I was wondering what was supposed to happen.
There's nothing that's supposed to happen. All I can tell you is what most people see. And most people see fluid seeming to run around in the rim, changing direction erratically and so on. That's what people see. Some people see also some kind of tunnel effect due to the spokes. But it depends an awful lot on what kind of paper I printed it on. Glossy paper works best. Depends on the illumination and so on. But generally, people see that water running around in the rim.
Could you ask how many people saw that? Please, could you ask for a show of hands how many people saw that?
How many people saw the water running around? Oh, I guess it looks like 60% or so. You don't have to feel bad.
Two last questions. Please introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Arthur Pilon from Pacific Ventures. Actually, on one of the experiments that you showed that the circle was supposed to go around, I actually didn't see the circle going around, but I saw a pulsing. Is anybody associated with that too as well? There was actually nothing was going on, it was just showing the pulsing. Yeah.
There are a lot of reactions. People see that. Other people do too.
So what does it mean as far as association with the other dots next to it, as you were explaining?
I don't know. I don't have an explanation for that. The only explanation I have is what I already said about fatigue of directional detectors, because that's known, and that little waterfall thing demonstrates its reality. I haven't tried to demonstrate this pulsation or whatever else you see, but that would be an interesting project.
Last two questions.
Hi, my name is Brenda Ng, and I'm from Lawrence Livermore Lab. The question I want to ask is that the noise inherent in a person, does it vary with age? As in, do children exhibit stronger or weaker noise?
Well, I'm 80 years old, and my grandchildren are 3 and 4. And then there's another batch of grandchildren who are 12 and 13. And we all see about the same thing. That's about, I don't have any systematic, population studies, but qualitatively, it seems to be fine.
The last question.
Hi, I'm David Groshoff, and you were actually on my qualifying committee for here at Berkeley. My question is, if you actually put in subthreshold visual signals in the empty spots in the cartwheel, whether there's an increase in the salience of the perception, or also, perhaps, if you show a version of this stimulus under scotopic conditions, when you have a certain amount of noise in the form of spontaneous rhodopsin isomerizations coming in from the retina.
I've wondered about that same thing. That is, could we improve vision of people by pumping a little bit of noise in one way or the other? And it seems possible, but I don't dare mess around with people. So I can talk to the people in the optometry college and see whether they have techniques and of doing that. But I think it's a very serious, a good idea. So we'll end up with glasses that fluctuate.
Please, go ahead. Just the last question.
Yeah, thanks so much. Because I'm really intrigued by this. Do you,
Please
in your...
introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Charles Ostman, Institute for Global Futures. And I've really been intrigued for a long time with this concept of sensory enhancement and other ways to kind of change cognitive thresholds. So by introducing this sort of stochastic resonance, do you see other forms of cognition that you might want to be experimenting with?
I haven't tried. I mean, all I've done is what I've described. But I think it's probably a general principle. Now, I don't know whether it's going to apply to mental processes like Arby told us about. But it might be, as somebody else asked, it might apply to hearing, so towards the sensory system. But I have no real proof of that.
Right, but it's a concept that could be explored, perhaps.
It could be, yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, I have a friend who's a very famous mathematician who claimed for a while that he did his best work in noisy bars. And he's older now, and he claims it's not true anymore.
Once more, thank you so much, Professor Glaser.